Welcome to the Pod Circle podcast, where we bring practical tips and insights for every podcaster.
From aspiring podcasters to experts with hundreds of episodes under your belt and everywhere in between, these conversations dive into the topics that matter most to you. All right, Kyle, what are we talking about today?
We are talking about how to convert your social media followers into podcast subscribers. Is a really important topic.
Yeah, I think it's one that can kind of work in both ways. Like first, you start a podcast after having a pretty large social following. Maybe that's why you went into the podcasting space, because you wanted to give your audience more of you. Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe you have a podcast and are now trying to push your podcast to build your social audience. But either way, I think there is an importance at looking at how do we have more, if we think about our Venn diagrams, right? Our Venn diagram of podcast listeners and our Venn diagram of social followers. How do we make that overlap a little bit bigger?
So we're actually going to dive right in. We've got about 6 or 7 things here. And if you've been a long-time listener of the podcast, you have heard us say before that even if you are an audio-only podcast, to still always record a video element if you can. Even if you don't have a video podcast, record those videos, because either now or later, you might decide to turn those into social media assets like Reels, which we're a huge fan of. We do that for the Pod Circle podcast. If you follow us on really any of the socials, but especially Instagram, you'll see Reels show up all the time from us, which are just little clips from the podcast. We do the very same thing to try to promote this podcast and take, a 15 or 20 minute episode, and we can find sometimes 10 or 15 different bite-sized 45-second nuggets from that podcast and edit them down into those clips that look really good. So we always encourage people to do that. You can also pull a really key quote or a takeaway and form that into just a static quote image or a carousel for, is carousel Instagram or LinkedIn or?
Both, I think. For
both? Okay. I didn't know if the terminology translated, but those are really cool and really popular as well. So there's just so much content that you can create out of a single podcast episode. So we really encourage people to do that and leverage their social media following that way.
I feel like I'm seeing this all over recently, especially. I think I'm seeing so many creators that I have started following for a long time and now seeing their podcasts and how they're utilizing this. A couple of podcasts I think do this really well. The guys from It's Always Sunny, they have a podcast where they often bring on Danny DeVito and that kind of stuff. And I watch their clips, but don't actually listen to their podcast. But they have intrigued me and started, yet. And I have started listening to them. Also, all the hype of the town. Should we jump on it? The Kelsey brothers. I am now in the Venn diagram of people that care about the Kelsey brothers because of my interest in Taylor Swift.
Yeah, I was going to say that probably didn't hurt.
No, that didn't hurt at all. But they utilize video really well on their channel. And I follow one of them and have now subscribed to their podcast. Keep it on the DL, right? Yeah.
Oh, no, I love New Heights. I was an early adopter of that podcast. Just one, because I'm a big NFL fan. The two brothers, they played each other in the Super Bowl last year. And then I saw their podcast out of that. And I was like, man, the production company that puts it on, I'm just so impressed with their work. And wrangling two very busy, very rich football players, getting them to sit down in front of a computer. I'm sure there's some setup involved, like all the behind the scenes stuff. I'm like, that the fact that they pull that off on a weekly basis is nothing short of a miracle, honestly. And in fact, they're in 2 different places. So I'm sure they're using Riverside like we are. I already know they're using the same mics that you and I do, the Shure MV7, because I've checked them out. So one more for me before I kick it over to you is if you have a Linktree especially for your Instagram, hopefully you do, but always update that Linktree with your most recent episodes and let people know that, that's where they can find them. So for a lot of you, that's going to be an obvious thing, but sometimes that Linktree can go kind of dormant. We can kind of forget to get in there and to update that with the latest podcast episode or blog. So just a friendly reminder to hit that Linktree and update that on a weekly basis if you can.
Absolutely. And it's important to tell people you have a podcast. So I think if you already have a pre-existing social audience, they may not know you have a podcast. Just ask them. I feel like let's just start there. If you want to convert your social media followers to podcast listeners, tell them. when you are super serving them and they're loving what you're putting out in the world, they're going to want more from you. I firmly believe that. I firmly believe in creating content that serves people, super serves them enough that they want to engage with you farther. And we talk about this all the time, Kyle, right? Like give them little breadcrumbs. Give them little snippets where they start with a 60-second reel, and then maybe it's a longer reel, and then they want to listen more to you. So they listen to one episode, then they subscribe, and then they eventually convert to a loyal, raving fan and customer to whatever your end goal of your podcast is.
It's a big ask to ask a social media follower, whether they're really engaged or they just kind of follow you and, like your posts every once in a while, to jump over to Apple, find your podcast, listen to a 30, 45 minute, hour-long episode. That's a big commitment. So you've got to kind of tease it out. And to your point, like you said earlier, you would is it the Always Sunny podcast where you loved the clips, and then eventually they're going to get you. They're like, okay, I want to listen to a whole episode. And that's just how it works. And it might take a while to get there, but long game. We're always talking about that. So
it's a long game. There are a couple of things that I think you need to be thinking about is how do we organically think about our podcast content, our emails, our social media as an entire ecosystem. And so I always say, what are ways that you can plug whatever your social media followers are giving you from an engagement standpoint into further things? So maybe they're DMing you with a specific question. You can briefly answer it and then say, hey, go into this deeper in this podcast episode. Send them a specific episode. One, you're engaging personally, and they're going to love that. Two, you're getting them to your podcast. How do you take the theme of the podcast for the week and start off with a story at the front of the week and say, hey, I'm diving into this week. And just really throughout the week, talk more and more about what you're talking about. Example, let's say we have a podcast on the best podcast mic. We could hop on and say, hey, here's our podcast mic. We want to talk to you about it this week. And then we'll have a blog, and then we'll do this, and we'll just continue to push you there. Someone I think really does this well, Jess Connolly, had a podcast for a really long time. She's been in the podcast space a really long time. I've been a loyal follower and have never taken the leap over into her podcast. It has changed, kind of how she approaches it has changed over the years. But recently she relaunched as the Jess Connolly Show. And she is really highlighting how she's diversifying her content. She started the week and one episode was all about taking the fuss out of fashion. And she's not a fashion blogger, but it relates to her overall content and her themes. So she talked about it all throughout the week. And she just kept coming back to different ways that fashion shows up in our lives. And at the end of the week, she even called it out and said, okay, I'm done with this. You'll never have to hear about fashion from me again for a little bit. But she talked about it all week. And I went and listened to that episode because it had we say it takes 12 touches in a marketing standpoint to get people to convert. So there's that. The last is a social media contest. And not just, hey, go subscribe, here's a social media contest. But if you're running one anyway, one of the ways that someone could get an extra entry, and there are apps that allow you to do this, one of the ways they can get an extra entry is by subscribing to your podcast. So I think that's something to look into. I think the podcast that I've used the most is Glimmer around that. But don't quote me on that. Just Google, what are ways that I can host a social media contest? And then that can be one of the ways that people get extra entries. So
that's really smart. I like that. Two more kind of bonus tips here. Landing notable guests. So if you're thinking about starting a podcast or if you already have a podcast, you know how important it is to really land that guest that's in your space that's going to captivate your audience. And more times than not, that person's going to have a pretty good social media following. So maybe, most podcasters that get into it aren't social media influencers turned podcasters. So it really helps to leverage someone like that's network. And also just, be a great first handful of guests for your podcast. So the key thing to do there is to produce really good social media clips and share that with them. Edit the clips down, make them really tight, make them look good. And also let them know, send them to your guests and let them know hey, this episode's going to air on this day. I would love if you would consider posting up a story on Instagram. And a lot of people know this, some people don't, but you can actually post outbound links in Instagram stories now, which is really, really useful for, from getting people from social media, which is what this podcast is all about, and then converting them into podcast listeners. and hopefully, fingers crossed, into podcast subscribers.
Yes. When I was a baby social media marketer lots of years ago, the only people that were allowed swipe up links were those with like 10,000 followers. And now we all can have it. On that same idea, what I have seen successful in my own space is that I literally have a templated email that I send every time an episode releases. I say to the guest, here's your episode. Here's the show description. Here's some like key quotes from the episode. Here's your links. And we created you assets. And then I share them. And that's been super beneficial to make it easy for them. And two, if it's a really big guest that I want to share, sometimes I will create assets that I know are in their branding. And I can kind of steal their colors or, nothing too explicit, but knowing that they'll be willing to post it when it looks more like what they're already doing. And it'll kind of fit into their flow of what they're putting out in their content. So
that is so smart. And I think that extra effort goes a long way. I'm curious, like how you actually package that up. Do you drop those clips in like a Dropbox? And then like, I'm curious the packaging of it, how you do that for big guests.
Yeah. We have a Dropbox link that we usually throw things into, and I'll have a couple options. I'll have my designer design like 3 or 4 different ones because there are people that say, hey, I'd love to share, but I don't want to share anything that anyone else is sharing. I don't want to share the same thing you're sharing. I want it to really be like individualized content. Totally fine. I'll create you a couple different options. I might do one with your photo, without your photo. I might do one with a quote and then your photo in the corner. I might just do your quote. I will make sure that I give both square and story formats of all the assets I'm giving. If we have video, I'll utilize that and make sure it puts them in a good light and really highlights them and their story. And then the coloring, we'll make sure that we've got our branding on it, but that it kind of fits in with their aesthetic too. So yeah, and then I just send a Dropbox link with all the things and say, hey, let me know if there's anything you need. And then I do tag them. Then we post on our end and tag them so that they can easily reshare it if they don't want to create their own post too.
It's eliminating all the barriers, which I think is really important.
And give them a heads up. Hey, in 2 weeks, it's going to release on this day, because some people plan out their content. And that's a mistake that I have made and sometimes continue to make when I don't give them a heads up or have forethought around it, because they've already got their content planned and they don't want to mess with that. So I can get a more organic and more thought out, not just a share, if I can say, hey, in 2 weeks, you'll release.
Yes. And that'll bring up a final point, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah.
Is the importance of getting ahead with your episodes. Yeah, you can do all of the things that Mackenzie just said by trying to stay ahead. And that's easier to do if you create more kind of evergreen content, if you're not like a newsy podcast where you're just reacting to what happened yesterday. But in this case, it's really, really helpful for yourself and for the success of your podcast, but also for your guests to get ahead, let them know like, hey, this episode, all these assets are here for you. It's launching this day. Would love your support. So anything else on your end, Mackenzie?
I think just my encouragement would be to super serve people. And we talked about this in one of our previous episodes, but we want to focus on quality over quantity. So whatever social media following you have today, if it's 100 people, if it's 50 people, if it's 15,000 people, if you're taking care of them, really be intentional with how you're serving them, and it'll pay dividends. Yeah, absolutely. It's really well said. Before we go, we would love if you would consider giving us a rating and review. Subscribe to the podcast. We're going to be at you every week with new content around podcasting, tips, tricks, things that are happening in the podcast space. I don't know if you guys heard this past week. It was big news that Google Podcasts is actually shutting down. We talked about that in the newsletter. Yeah, we just had a newsletter that went out and we kind of addressed that and shined a light on what's going on there. So grateful to be in front of you guys and have a platform to share these kinds of things. We're obviously big fans of what podcasting can do, really for whatever you're doing, whether you're a business owner or you're an influencer, you're a course creator, you're an author, you're a speaker. Podcasts are very powerful in terms of creating that connection and that intimacy with your listeners and your followers. And so just a few tips today on how to take those social media followers, turn them into podcast listeners. Hope you found it was helpful. And if you did, subscribe. And follow us on social media. And follow us on social @PodCircle. Have a great week. We'll talk to you guys next week.